The night Sarah Matthews was thrown out of her in-laws' house, the rain was relentless. 8 months pregnant and alone, she had nowhere to go but her grandfather's abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The old place had been forgotten for 15 years, a relic of family history she barely remembered. With trembling hands, she found the key under the moss-covered stone, exactly where he'd always kept it. The musty air of a decade and a half of silence greeted her as she stepped inside. The beam of her flashlight danced over dust-shrouded furniture and yellowed photographs. In the attic, behind a false panel in the wall, Sarah discovered an old wooden chest. What treasures were hidden inside that would change not only her life, but her family's legacy forever? The torn wedding photograph sat on the dashboard of Sarah's old sedan, a painful memento of happier days. She sat motionless, the rain drumming on the roof, watching the Matthews mansion grow smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. 6 months ago, she had everything: a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a baby on the way. Now, 8 months pregnant, she had nothing but the clothes on her back and what she'd managed to throw into a suitcase. Michael had been the golden boy of the Matthews family, heir to their real estate empire. Their wedding day had been a lavish affair, splashed across the local society pages, the merging of old money and new beauty. They called it Sarah's humble background, and it had always been a point of contention with her in-laws. But Michael had loved her for it. "They'll come around," he used to say, kissing her forehead. "Just give them time." But time had run out 3 months ago, on a rainy night much like this one. The police officer at the door, hat in his hand. The words that shattered her world. Single vehicle accident. He died on impact. No suffering. Eleanor Matthews had collapsed into her husband's arms. Richard Matthews had stared at Sarah with hollow eyes. No one comforted her. The funeral was a blur, as were the weeks that followed. Weeks of silent meals and accusing glares. Sarah overheard Eleanor one night, her voice thick with whiskey and grief. If he hadn't been rushing home to her, he'd still be alive. That had been the breaking point. Richard summoned her to his office, a room as cold and clinical as his demeanor. "Sarah, it's time we discussed practical matters. Michael left no will, which means his assets revert to us. But the baby will be provided for. We are not monsters, of course." His tone suggested otherwise. A monthly stipend, contingent on certain arrangements. Those arrangements included Sarah relinquishing custodial decisions to the Matthews family and moving into a small apartment they owned. For supervision, as Richard had called it. When Sarah refused, the facade of civility crumbled. Eleanor screamed about worthless gold diggers and trapping their son. Security was called. Sarah was escorted out into the rain, clutching her hastily packed bag, the house keys tossed on the wet pavement behind her like scraps for a dog. Now, with nowhere left to turn, Sarah found herself driving to the only other place she had ever called home. Her grandfather, Arthur Grant's farmhouse, just outside town. He had passed away 5 years ago, and the property had sat empty ever since. Sarah hadn't been back since his funeral. Family complications had kept her away. Complications her grandfather would have understood. The small inheritance he'd left her had helped fund her college education, but the house itself was tied up in legal matters she had never fully grasped. James Parker, her grandfather's lawyer, had mentioned something about conditions and timelines, but Sarah had been 19 and uninterested in estate law. As Sarah drove through the countryside, her baby kicked vigorously. "I know, little one," she whispered, placing a hand on her swollen belly. I don't know what we're going to do either. The old country road was barely visible in the downpour. Memory guided her more than sight. Past the old Miller farm, a right at the lightning-scarred oak, down the winding lane that seemed to lead nowhere. Then, suddenly, there it was. Her grandfather's Victorian farmhouse, silhouetted against the stormy sky, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The front porch sagged slightly to one side. The once vibrant garden had run wild, taking over the front yard. But the maple tree where her grandfather had hung a tire swing still stood strong against the elements. Sarah parked and sat for a long moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The baby kicked again, more insistent this time. This is it for now, she said to her unborn child. The only place we have left. With one hand supporting her back, Sarah made her way to the porch, her small suitcase bumping against her leg. The spare key, if her grandfather hadn't changed his ways, would be under the large river stone next to the faded garden gnome. Her fingers found it right where it had always been, cold and waiting, as if it had been expecting her all these years. The door groaned open, revealing darkness and the stale scent of abandonment. Sarah stepped into the shadows of her past and toward whatever uncertain future awaited her. Morning light streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the farmhouse's worn wooden floors. Sarah had spent a fitful night on the old living room sofa, her pregnant body protesting the lumpy cushions. Now, with daylight illuminating the home, she began to properly explore her childhood's summer refuge. The familiar smell of cedar and old books brought memories flooding back. Her grandfather, standing at the stove, making his famous blueberry pancakes. The sound of his deep laugh as he taught her to play chess by the fireplace. His patient hands guiding hers as they repaired an old radio together. He was an engineer, Sarah murmured to her unborn child, running her fingers along the spines of the technical books that lined the study shelves. A self-taught genius, he used to say. In the kitchen, everything remained eerily untouched. Dishes still in the drying rack, a coffee mug on the counter, as if Arthur had simply stepped out for a moment rather than passed away 5 years ago. Sarah opened the cupboards to find long-expired canned goods. The refrigerator was empty and unplugged. Upstairs, she entered her grandfather's bedroom cautiously, feeling like an intruder despite being his only living relative. The bed was neatly made with a patchwork quilt her grandmother had sewn decades ago. On the nightstand sat his pocket watch, a beautiful antique timepiece with intricate engravings. Sarah picked it up gently. It had stopped at 6 o'clock. According to the death certificate, her grandfather had passed away at 7:45 in the morning. A heart attack while tending his garden. An hour and 45 minutes of life unaccounted for, frozen forever on the watch's face. He loved this old thing, she told her baby, rubbing a thumb over the tarnished surface. Time is the only puzzle I can't solve, he used to say. A sharp knock on the front door startled her. Sarah made her way carefully down the stairs, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the banister. Through the peephole, she saw an elderly woman holding a casserole dish. "Hello?" Sarah called through the door. "Sarah Grant? Is that you, child?" The woman's voice was weathered but kind. "It's Evelyn Wilson from next door." Sarah opened the door to Mrs. Wilson, now in her 80s but still spry, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun. Sarah recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Wilson, I haven't seen you since your grandfather's funeral," the woman finished. stepping inside without an invitation. "It's been too long. I brought chicken casserole. You look like you could use a hot meal." In the kitchen, Mrs. Wilson efficiently reheated the food while Sarah explained her situation, the condensed version, leaving out the harsh details of her eviction. "Saw the lights last night," Mrs. Wilson said, setting a generous portion in front of Sarah. "Been keeping an eye on the place all these years." She paused. "Arthur asked me to." Sarah paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "He specifically asked you?" Mrs. Wilson nodded. "Said you might come back one day. Told me to make sure things stayed put." "What does that mean?" The older woman shrugged. "Your grandfather was a private man. Brilliant, but private." She glanced around the kitchen. "The folks in town, they had their theories." "Theories about what?" "About where he went for those 3 years back in the 70s. Sarah frowned. "What 3 years? I didn't know anything about that." Mrs. Wilson looked surprised. "Oh my! Your grandfather disappeared for 3 solid years. Said he was on a research expedition. When he came back, he was different. Built this place, started his workshop. Never spoke a word about where he'd been." Sarah's mind reeled. She had never heard this story in all her childhood summers. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Wilson continued, lowering her voice. "You've had visitors, men in suits, watching the property from the road. Never come close, but they take pictures. Been happening off and on for years. Don't know what they want. Never spoken to me." Mrs. Wilson stood, gathering the empty plates. "But Arthur did say that if you ever came back, I was to tell you to contact James Parker immediately. He still has his law practice in town. He has papers for you." After Mrs. Wilson left, promising to return with groceries, Sarah wandered the house with new eyes. What secrets had her kind, gentle grandfather been keeping? What happened during those 3 missing years? In the hall closet, behind winter coats untouched for ages, she found a door she'd never noticed as a child. It was locked. Another, in the pantry, hidden behind shelving, was also locked. The grandfather she thought she knew began to fade, replaced by a stranger with secrets. As she climbed the stairs to continue her exploration, the pocket watch felt heavy in her hand. Time stopped. Stories untold. Mysteries waiting. The wooden chest sat in the center of the attic, its ornate carvings illuminated by the beam of Sarah's flashlight. After a restless night pondering Mrs. Wilson's revelations, she had returned to examine her discovery more closely. The chest was unlike anything she had ever seen. About 2 feet long, it was crafted from a dark, polished wood, inlaid with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the dancing light. "What were you hiding, Grandpa?" Sarah whispered, running her fingers over the smooth surface. The locking mechanism was just as unusual. It wasn't a keyhole, but a series of concentric metal rings with symbols etched into their circumference. Sarah tried to turn them, but they remained firmly fixed. It was no ordinary lock. It looked custom-made, perhaps by her grandfather's own hands. Sarah sat back on her heels, grimacing as the baby shifted. "Your great-grandfather was quite the mystery man," she said, rubbing her belly. "Let's see if we can solve his puzzle." She examined the symbols more closely. They were numbers, but arranged in no discernible pattern. Sarah tried birthdays, anniversaries, significant dates. Nothing worked. The chest remained stubbornly sealed. As the afternoon light faded, Sarah reluctantly descended from the attic. In her grandfather's study, She began to methodically search his books, looking for a clue, a hidden note. On the third shelf, tucked between engineering manuals, she found a worn copy of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, her grandfather's favorite novel, the one he read to her every summer. As she opened it, Sarah discovered the margins were filled with her grandfather's elegant script. Numbers, equations, and cryptic notes covered nearly every page. On the inside back cover, one series of numbers had been circled with particular emphasis. 7, 1542, 931. Could it be that simple? Sarah asked aloud. Her trip back to the attic was interrupted by the shrill ring of the farmhouse's old rotary phone. Sarah stared at it in surprise. She hadn't realized the line was still active. After the fourth ring, she hesitantly picked up the receiver. Hello? Silence. Then a man's voice, low and measured. Is this the Grant residence? Yes, Sarah answered cautiously. Who's calling? You must be Sarah. The voice sounded pleased. Arthur's granddaughter. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Who is this? Someone who knew your grandfather well. I understand you've recently taken up residence in his home. Sarah was silent, unnerved by the stranger's knowledge. Arthur left behind quite a legacy, the voice continued. More valuable than most people realize. We should meet to discuss it. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah said firmly. And I'm not meeting with anyone. I think you do, Sarah. The question is whether you've found it yet. The caller paused. Arthur's legacy was not meant for just anyone. Be careful who you trust. The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She replaced the receiver with a trembling hand, suddenly aware of her isolation. Outside, twilight had fallen, the shadows deepening in the overgrown yard. Was someone watching the house? The stranger's words echoed in her mind. Be careful who you trust. Sarah moved through the downstairs, closing curtains and checking locks. The old farmhouse suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. In the kitchen, she found a heavy cast-iron skillet and carried it upstairs with her. A meager defense, but one that offered some comfort. Back in the attic, Sarah approached the chest with renewed determination. The mysterious call had only confirmed her suspicions. Whatever her grandfather had hidden, it was valuable enough to attract attention, even years after his death. She aligned the metal rings to match the numbers from the book. 7, 15, 42, 931. Nothing happened. Sarah frowned. She then tried various combinations, sequences, and patterns. Still nothing. As her frustration mounted, Sarah's gaze fell on her grandfather's pocket watch, which he had placed beside the chest. It had stopped at 7:42. Wait, she murmured, glancing between the watch and her notes. 7:42, not separate numbers. With trembling fingers, Sarah realigned the rings. 742, 159, 31. A soft click echoed from within the chest. Sarah held her breath as she lifted the lid, which now moved freely. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was a leather-bound journal with her grandfather's initials embossed on the cover. Beneath it lay a time-yellowed blueprint, and at the very bottom, a photograph of her grandfather standing beside a group of serious-looking men in lab coats, all posing in front of a building Sarah didn't recognize. She lifted the journal with reverence. The first page held only a single line, in her grandfather's distinctive script. For Sarah, when the time is right, trust no one. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was a child again, visiting her grandfather during summer vacation. Reality returned as her baby kicked vigorously, reminding her of her current situation. Wrapping herself in a worn-out robe she found in the bedroom closet, Sarah went downstairs to find Mrs. Wilson busy in the kitchen. "Figured you could use a proper breakfast," the old woman said, without turning around. "Pregnant women need their strength." "How did you get in?" Sarah asked, alarmed, despite the welcome sight of food. Mrs. Wilson produced an old brass key from her pocket. "Arthur gave me this years ago, for emergencies." She glanced at Sarah's prominent belly. "I'd say this qualifies." As they ate eggs and bacon, Mrs. Wilson began unloading the grocery bags she had brought with her. "I took the liberty of calling James Parker," she said casually. "He's expecting you at 3. Sarah nearly choked on her toast. "You called the lawyer? Why?" "Because Arthur was explicit on this point. If you ever came home, James was to be notified immediately." Mrs. Wilson's expression softened. "There are things you need to know, dear. Things I'm not at liberty to tell you." After breakfast, Mrs. Wilson led Sarah to a cedar chest in the guest room. From inside, she retrieved a manila envelope filled with yellowed newspaper clippings. "I started collecting these after Arthur passed," she explained, spreading the articles across the bed. "Thought they might be important someday." The headlines spanned decades. Most were from the local paper, but a few came from scientific journals and national publications. "Local engineer takes leave for research expedition, 1974. Arthur Grant returns after 3-year absence, 1977. Mysterious energy field discovery claimed by independent researcher, 1980. Monarch Industries denies accusations of industrial espionage, 1985. Reclusive inventor refuses multi-million-dollar offer, 1992. Sarah's hands shook as she examined a photograph accompanying one article. Her grandfather, looking much younger but unmistakable with his signature beard, stood next to a complicated piece of equipment she couldn't identify. "He never talked about any of this," Sarah whispered. "No, he wouldn't have," Mrs. Wilson replied, more to herself than to Sarah. "What was he protecting you from?" "That's what James will explain," Mrs. Wilson said, gathering the clippings. "But I can tell you this. When Arthur disappeared in 1974, it wasn't for any research expedition. Not the kind people imagined, anyway." "How do you know?" "Because my late husband worked security at Monarch Industries back then. The company spent a fortune trying to find Arthur after he vanished." Mrs. Wilson's eyes darkened. And they weren't the only ones looking. Before Sarah could press her, Mrs. Wilson glanced at the clock. "We should leave for town soon. James doesn't like to be kept waiting." The drive to town revealed how much had changed in the 5 years since Sarah's last visit. New strip malls had replaced familiar landmarks, though the central town square remained largely untouched. Parker Legal Services occupied the same Victorian building it had for decades, its brass plaque newly polished, but otherwise unchanged. James Parker had aged considerably since Sarah last saw him at her grandfather's funeral. His once dark hair had gone completely white, though his piercing blue eyes retained their sharpness. "Sarah Grant," he said warmly, rising from behind an imposing mahogany desk. "Though I understand it's Matthews now." "Actually, it's Grant again," Sarah replied, unconsciously touching her bare ring finger. Something like approval flickered across Parker's face. "Your grandfather would be pleased to hear that." After settling into a leather chair that accommodated her pregnant form with surprising comfort, Sarah looked directly at the lawyer. Mrs. Wilson said you have information about my grandfather, about who he really was. Parker nodded gravely. I do indeed. But first I need to clarify your legal standing. He opened a thick file folder. Contrary to what you may have believed, your grandfather's house has not been in legal limbo for the past 5 years. The estate was held in a trust, with very specific conditions for its transfer. Transfer to whom? To you, Sarah, but only when you returned to claim it of your own free will. Parker slid a document across the desk. As of today, you are the sole owner of not only the house and land, but everything in it. Sarah stared at the paper, its official language confirming Parker's claim. Why all the secrecy? Why not just leave everything to me directly? Because what's hidden in that house, Parker said calmly, is worth killing for. And there are people who have been waiting a very long time to get their hands on it. James Parker walked to a safe set into the wall, concealed behind an oil painting of the historic town courthouse. After spinning the combination, he retrieved a sealed envelope and a weathered leather portfolio. Your grandfather left explicit instructions, Parker explained, returning to his desk. This meeting was planned for years, right down to the documents I was to show you. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, feeling her baby react to her rising anxiety. How could he have known I'd come back? Or that I'd be in this situation? She gestured to her pregnant belly. Arthur Grant was many things, Parker said. But above all, he was a man who understood patterns, human patterns, scientific patterns. He knew life often comes full circle. He opened the portfolio. Inside was Arthur's will, not the public document that was executed after his death, but a private addendum written in her grandfather's meticulous hand and notarized with Parker's signature. I, Arthur James Grant, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth the following conditions regarding my true estate, Sarah read aloud. The legal language soon gave way to more personal instructions. But when my granddaughter, Sarah, returns to the farm, and I am certain she will, when she has nowhere else to turn, she is to be granted my full inheritance, including the entire contents of my workshop, laboratory, and private vault. The knowledge contained within is both her birthright and her burden. Sarah looked up, bewildered. Laboratory, private vault. What is all this? Parker held up a hand. Keep reading. Sarah is to be warned that certain parties have maintained an interest in my work since 1977. Most notably, Monarch Industries and its subsidiaries, but others as well. These entities must never gain access to the catalyst or its specifications. What's the catalyst? Sarah interrupted. Your grandfather's life's work, Parker answered. The reason he disappeared for 3 years. The reason he lived as a virtual recluse. And the reason you must be extremely careful from now on. Sarah continued reading, her grandfather's words taking on a new urgency. If you are reading this, Sarah, know that I have prepared for this moment. The house contains everything you need to understand and protect my legacy. Trust James Parker and Evelyn Wilson, but verify everyone else. The key to the vault requires both intelligence and blood ties. Only you can access it. The document ended with a personal note that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. My dearest Sarah, forgive an old man his secrets. Everything I have done was to give you choices I never had. Whatever you decide to do with my work, know that I have absolute faith in your judgment. You were always the brightest light in my life. Parker gave her a moment to compose herself before sliding the sealed envelope across the desk. This is to be opened according to your grandfather's instructions, when the truth becomes clear. That's rather cryptic, Sarah said, taking the envelope. Arthur had a flair for the dramatic, Parker admitted with a small smile. But his concerns were legitimate. Monarch Industries has made several attempts to purchase the property since his death. Their offers have grown increasingly aggressive. Why would a major corporation want an old farmhouse? Because of what's underneath it, Parker said, leaning forward. Your grandfather's workshop extends far beyond what's visible. Most of his important work happened below ground. In a bunker? Sarah asked, incredulous. In a facility he built himself after he returned in 1977. Parker glanced at his watch. We shouldn't discuss this further here. You never know who might be listening these days. As if on cue, Parker's secretary buzzed the intercom. Mr. Parker, there are two gentlemen here asking about the Grant property. They don't have an appointment. Parker's expression hardened. Tell them I'm unavailable. To Sarah, he whispered, use the back exit. Mrs. Wilson is waiting in the alley. He guided her to a door hidden behind a bookshelf. I'll create a distraction. Go straight home and look for a red book on engineering principles in your grandfather's study. Page 42 has information on how to access the main workshop. Who are they? Sarah asked, gathering her papers. Monarch representatives, most likely. They monitor the property records closely. Before Sarah could ask more, Parker gently pushed her through the doorway. Remember what Arthur wrote. Trust, but verify. And Sarah, he added sternly, don't open the door for anyone, not even me, unless Mrs. Wilson is present. Things are about to get complicated. As the bookshelf clicked shut behind her, Sarah heard Parker greet someone in his office, his voice shifting to a jovial welcome. Through the wood, muffled but distinct, came a response in a familiar voice, the same voice from the mysterious phone call. The next morning brought clear skies and unwelcome visitors. Sarah was sifting through her grandfather's engineering books when Mrs. Wilson's urgent knock broke her concentration. Two men in a black sedan, the older woman reported, peeking through the lace curtains. Nice suits, city shoes. They're coming up the drive. Sarah's heart hammered, remembering Parker's warning. Do you recognize them? No, but I recognize the type. Mrs. Wilson's lips thinned. Businessmen. Never trust a man whose shoes cost more than a month's worth of groceries. The doorbell rang before Sarah could reply. After exchanging a weary look with Mrs. Wilson, she approached the front door, careful to stay out of sight of its glass panes. Who is it? Sarah called out. Miss Grant? David Chan and Robert Mercer from Monarch Industries. The voice was smooth, practiced. We'd like to speak with you about your property. Sarah held her breath. The company her grandfather had warned her about in his will. She opened the door just enough for the chain lock to catch, revealing two men in tailored suits. One was Asian, perhaps in his late 40s. The other was older, with silver hair and an aristocratic bearing. How did you know I was here? Sarah asked, her hand firm on the door. The younger man, Chan, offered an apologetic smile. Public records show the property was transferred yesterday. The first man, Mercer, announced. We've had an interest in this land for many years. I'm not selling, Sarah said, her voice unwavering. Perhaps we could discuss this inside, Mercer suggested, his tone laced with a thin veneer of politeness that barely concealed his condescension. I believe you'll find our offer compelling. Against her better judgment, but drawing strength from Mrs. Wilson's steady presence beside her, Sarah led them into the living room. She deliberately left them standing, making no offer of a seat or a drink. "We are prepared to offer you $3 million, Mercer stated, wasting no time on pleasantries. "A cash transaction. We cover all closing costs. You could be in a comfortable new home by the end of the month." Sarah blinked, momentarily stunned. The figure was wildly over the property's market value. The older man mistook her silence for a negotiating tactic. "4 million," he said, a tight smile on his lips. "And that is our final offer." Finding her voice, Sarah met his gaze. Why would Monarch Industries pay $4 million for an old farmhouse? Chen and Mercer exchanged a brief, calculated glance. "The location has strategic value for our green energy initiative," Chen explained smoothly. "And of course, the historical connection to your grandfather makes it significant to us." "What connection?" Sarah pressed. "Arthur Grant consulted for Monarch for a short time in the 70s, Mercer said dismissively. "A minor project. It never came to fruition." Beside Sarah, Mrs. Wilson let out a soft, derisive snort. Sarah's mind flashed to the old newspaper clippings she'd found. Articles that mentioned allegations of industrial espionage against Monarch. These men were lying. But why? "I'm afraid the property isn't for sale." "At any price," Sarah stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My grandfather wanted it to stay in the family." Mercer's cordial mask slipped, his expression hardening. "Miss Grant, you should consider your situation carefully." His gaze dropped pointedly to her pregnant belly. "A single mother needs security. This house, it has complications." "Complications?" "The title to the property has certain irregularities," Chen interjected. "Our legal team discovered potential liens that could prove problematic. We are, of course, willing to handle all of that as part of the purchase." The threat, though veiled, was perfectly clear. Sarah straightened, her hand instinctively moving to shield her abdomen. "If you're finished, gentlemen, I have things to do." "Here is my card," Chen said, placing it on a nearby table. "Please reconsider. Our offer won't remain on the table indefinitely." As he moved away, Sarah's eyes were drawn to the card. On its glossy surface was an unusual gold emblem, a stylized monarch butterfly, its wings etched with geometric patterns that were eerily similar to the carvings on her grandfather's chest. It was no coincidence. After ushering them out, Sarah watched from the window as they walked slowly around the property, snapping photos with their phones. Mrs. Wilson came to stand beside her. "They're surveying the grounds," the older woman observed grimly, "looking for access points." "Access to what?" "Whatever is down there," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice low. "Call James Parker. Now." Later, after a tense and cryptic conversation with Parker, Sarah stood at her kitchen window. She saw movement near the old storage shed. Chen was on his knees, examining something on the ground, while Mercer stood watch. "They never left," Sarah whispered in disbelief. Parker's warning echoed in her mind. Trust no one. She had let them into her home. She had let them see the look in her eyes, perhaps revealing that she knew more than she should. Watching them methodically combing over her land, Sarah realized with a sickening lurch that she had just escalated a conflict that had been simmering for decades. Her hand closed around the business card in her pocket. The golden monarch emblem seemed to burn against her skin, a symbol of the forces now arrayed against her and her unborn child. Forces her grandfather had spent his life trying to escape. For the first time, Sarah truly understood. She wasn't just living in her grandfather's house. She had inherited his war. Once she was certain they had finally gone, Sarah returned to the attic. With Mrs. Wilson standing guard downstairs, she knew she was on a timer. She had to uncover her grandfather's secrets before those men returned with more than just an offer. The leather-bound journal she'd found in the chest lay on the floor, its cover cracked with age. She had been afraid to open it, afraid of the truths it might hold. Now fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She carefully opened the cover. Her grandfather's distinct, elegant script greeted her like a voice from the past. The first entry began, September 17th, 1974. Tomorrow, I report to the Monarch facility. If my suspicions are correct, the principles of energy conversion I have theorized could revolutionize power generation for the entire world. Monarch has the resources to make the catalyst a reality, but something about Ellison's eagerness unsettles me. His questions stray far beyond scientific curiosity. Sarah turned the pages, her eyes scanning entries filled with complex equations and technical diagrams she couldn't begin to understand. But over the months, the tone of the entries shifted, the initial excitement slowly curdling into paranoia. April 3rd, 1975. I found surveillance equipment in my apartment. Monarch Security follows my every move. They claim it's for project security, but I've seen them copying my personal notes. Today, the Catalyst prototype exceeded all expectations. Ellison immediately began discussing its potential for militarization. This was never my intention. A chunk of pages had been violently torn from the journal, leaving a jarring gap in the timeline. When the entries resumed, the handwriting was different, shakier, more urgent. November 28th, 1977. 3 years. They held me for 3 years. The official story is a research expedition, but the truth would sound like the ravings of a madman. I escaped with nothing but the prototype and the core schematics. Monarch believes I destroyed everything. They can never know the truth. Sarah's hands trembled. Her kind, gentle grandfather, a prisoner? His life's work twisted into a weapon against his will? The mysterious 3-year absence Mrs. Wilson had spoken of, it wasn't a research trip. It was an abduction. Later entries documented his life after his return. The purchase of this farm, the secret construction, the constant, weary vigilance against Monarch's prying eyes. He detailed elaborate security systems, hidden rooms, and a network of trusted allies who shared his fears about the corporation's unchecked ambition. The final entry, dated just days before his death, was addressed to her. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. The catalyst is secure in the main vault. The combination requires dates that only you would know. Remember the summer of the lighthouse? That day changed everything for both of us. Sarah closed the journal, her mind reeling. The memory was sharp, vivid. The summer she turned 12. Her grandfather had taken her to an old lighthouse on the coast. Climbing the winding stairs, a sudden, terrifying tightness had seized her chest. A severe asthma attack. Arthur had carried her down, administered her emergency inhaler, and raced her to the hospital. It was there that doctors discovered an undiagnosed heart condition, one that could have killed her. He saved my life that day, Sarah whispered. July 16th, 2003. The day at the lighthouse. With renewed purpose, she turned back to the problem of the vault. The journal contained a detailed sketch of the farmhouse foundation, marking a hidden entrance in the cellar. A specific sequence of pressure-activated stones, it noted, would reveal a keypad. Sarah descended into the cool, musty air of the cellar. Following the diagram, she pressed the stones in the precise order her grandfather had indicated, a pattern that mirrored the Fibonacci sequence he had taught her as a game when she was a child. With a low groan, a section of the stone wall slid away, revealing a sleek, modern keypad that was jarringly out of place. Her hands shook as she entered the date. 716203. Nothing. She tried different formats, growing more frantic with each failure. Then she remembered his obsession with prime numbers, with elegant simplicity. She tried just the day and the year. 162003. A soft chime echoed in the small space, followed by the low hum of hydraulics. The wall receded further, exposing a heavy steel door set with a small, dark glass panel. A fingerprint scanner. Bloodline, Sarah breathed, Parker's word coming back to her. It required not just knowledge, but a direct connection. She pressed her palm flat against the scanner. A pale green light washed over her hand, and a synthesized voice spoke from a hidden speaker. DNA match confirmed. Welcome, Sarah Grant. The heavy door swung inward with a silent hydraulic hiss, revealing a sight that stole her breath. It wasn't a vault filled with gold or weapons. It was something infinitely more valuable. It was the truth. The steel door opened not into a small safe, but onto a narrow passageway sloping gently downward. Motion-activated lights flickered to life ahead of her, illuminating a tunnel walled with smooth, poured concrete. The air was cool and fresh, circulated by a hidden ventilation system. Bundles of cables and pipes ran along the walls, an infrastructure far too modern for the old farmhouse above. Sarah descended carefully, one hand trailing along the cold wall for support. The passage ran for 30 feet before opening into a space that defied belief. It was a cavernous, subterranean laboratory, larger than the footprint of the house itself. It was her grandfather's secret workshop. Workbenches were arranged in a wide circle at the center, each station dedicated to a different field of study. One held what looked like prototype energy generators. Another was a fully equipped chemistry lab. A third was dedicated to medical research, complete with high-powered microscopes and biocontainment hoods. The computer equipment, while 2 decades old, was more advanced than anything a private individual should have possessed. "How, Grandpa?" Sarah whispered, her voice a faint echo in the massive chamber. "How did you build all this?" Along the far wall stood a bank of fireproof file cabinets, their drawers meticulously labeled in his precise hand. Beside them, set directly into the concrete, was a heavy vault door, the final repository, she assumed, for the catalyst Monarch so desperately wanted. She walked to the nearest workbench. Under protective glass lay a set of blueprints. The technical jargon was meaningless to her, but the title was unmistakable. Catalyst Protocol, Generation 3. The dates on the revision notes showed he had continued his work until 2010, only a few years before he died. In a far corner, a door was slightly ajar. It led to a small, Spartan living space. A cot, a kitchenette, a bathroom. He could have lived down here for weeks at a time. On a small shelf, technical manuals sat beside well-worn literary classics. His reading glasses rested on a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, a bookmark holding his place near the end. The small, human detail made her heart ache. Back in the main lab, her attention was drawn to an apparatus at the very center of the room. A series of small indicator lights blinked steadily on its surface, showing it was still operational. At its heart was an empty cylindrical chamber the size of a coffee can, connected by thick, shielded cables to an array of monitoring equipment and backup power supplies. The housing for the catalyst, she realized. Before she could examine it further, a slight whirring sound caught her attention. High above, a small security camera mounted on the ceiling swiveled to track her movement. She hadn't turned it on. The system was active. It was watching. Beside the main computer terminal, she saw an envelope. Her name was written on the front in his familiar hand. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The system has registered your entry. Others will now know the workshop has been breached. You have approximately 12 hours before they arrive. The video protocols are ready. Station 3, bottom drawer. With trembling fingers, she pulled open the indicated drawer. Inside, neatly packed in foam, was a small video camera and a set of simple instructions. He had planned for this. He had left her a way to fight back. She set up the camera as instructed, positioning it to capture both her face and the main computer monitor. The moment she hit the record button, the screen flared to life, displaying the root directory of a vast, encrypted database. Arthur's research. As she began to work, her search for the vault's combination led her to a workbench drawer with a false bottom. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment. Inside was a small thumb drive and a simple remote with a single red button. And beneath them, a final note. Door mechanism behind pantry. Emergency exit if workshop is compromised. Single use only. Sarah pocketed the items, her mind racing. Her grandfather had given her the tools. Now, she just had to figure out how to use them. She was acutely aware that her presence here had started a countdown, and the clock was ticking. In 12 hours, according to her grandfather's warning, they would come. Monarch Industries, alerted by security protocols to the activity in the workshop, after years of dormancy, would be here. The vault in the wall remained her primary objective. Unlike the relatively simple combination that had granted her access to the workshop, this one demanded a far more complex security protocol. A retinal scanner, a keypad, and what looked like a voice recognition system protected whatever lay inside. As Sarah contemplated her next move, a low mechanical hum emanated from somewhere above. The ventilation system had changed its rhythm, or perhaps something else had activated. Sarah glanced up again at the camera on the ceiling. The red recording light was now blinking rapidly. Someone was accessing the security system remotely. She was no longer alone in her grandfather's secret domain. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as the security camera continued its silent watch. She had to work fast. Following her grandfather's instructions, she returned to the recording station and connected the equipment according to his detailed diagrams. The main monitor flickered to life, displaying a loading bar. Alpha protocol initiated, the screen flashed. Voice print required. Sarah Elizabeth Grant, she said clearly, remembering her grandfather's obsession with biometric security. The system processed for several seconds before responding. Voice print accepted. Loading message sequence. A larger monitor went dark, then illuminated with her grandfather's face. Arthur Grant looked much as she remembered him. Features etched by time, intelligent eyes, a neatly trimmed white beard. According to the timestamp, the recording had been made just weeks before his death. Sarah, his voice so familiar and mist, filled the workshop. If you're seeing this, then several contingencies have been triggered. You've returned to the farmhouse, you've found the workshop, and most importantly, you've activated the security protocols that have alerted certain people to your presence. Arthur shifted in his chair, his expression grave. I don't have much time to explain, but I'll try to give you what you need to make informed decisions. The catalyst is my life's work, an energy conversion technology that creates clean, sustainable power with minimal resources. A small device could power a city block indefinitely. On a large scale, it could revolutionize how humanity generates energy. Images appeared beside Arthur's face. Schematics, test results, prototype iterations. I developed the theoretical framework in the 1960s, but lacked the resources for practical application. When Monarch Industries approached me in 1974, I believed their interest was genuine. I was wrong. Arthur's face hardened. Monarch's CEO, Warren Ellison, quickly saw that the catalyst could be weaponized. Its principles of energy conversion, when inverted, create a devastatingly efficient means of energy extraction. They wanted to develop weapons that could instantly drain all power from enemy infrastructure or from living tissue. Sarah drew a sharp breath, her hand instinctively going to her belly. I refused to continue the research, Arthur went on. It was then I discovered I was not a collaborator, but a prisoner. For 3 years, they held me in a secure facility, forcing me to continue the work under duress. What they didn't realize was that I had embedded a fundamental flaw into every prototype, a deliberate limitation that prevented it from being weaponized. Arthur leaned closer to the camera. In 1977, I escaped with the only functional prototype and the critical research data. Monarch has spent decades trying to replicate my work, without success. The flaw I introduced requires knowledge they do not possess, knowledge I preserved for someone I could trust. For you, Sarah. The image changed to show the vault in the wall. The catalyst prototype is secured in here. The combination requires genetic confirmation and the correct sequence. Think back to our last conversation before you left for college. The advice I gave you about forging your own path. Sarah's mind raced back to that day. Her grandfather had quoted Thoreau. If one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. Success in common hours, Sarah whispered. She even remembered the date of that conversation, August 28th, 2010. You have a choice to make, Arthur continued. The world needs this technology, but releasing it carelessly could be catastrophic. Monarch isn't the only entity that would weaponize it. I've prepared 3 options. He held up a thumb drive identical to the one Sarah had found. This contains the complete documentation, ready for publication through secure channels. Trusted colleagues I worked with in secret will help protect and implement this knowledge for the benefit of humanity. Next, he displayed a small device. This remote detonator will destroy all research materials, including the catalyst prototype. Nothing would be left for Monarch or anyone else to exploit. Finally, Arthur's expression softened. The third option is to continue my work. The workshop is yours. The knowledge is yours. You always had the brilliant mind that I lacked. Sarah, you can take this further than I ever could. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as her grandfather's final message played. Whatever you choose, do it quickly. The security alert will bring Monarch here within hours. Use the emergency exit I prepared. The passage leads to a drainage culvert half a mile from the property. Mrs. Wilson knows the rendezvous point. Arthur's image began to fade. I love you, Sarah. I've always been proud of you, and I am so sorry for the burden I've placed on your shoulders. Trust your instincts. They have never led you astray. The screen went dark for a moment, then displayed a countdown clock. 10:42:17. and ticking down, the time remaining before Monarch's arrival. Wiping away her tears, Sarah turned to the vault. She had less than 11 hours to retrieve the catalyst, weigh her options, and escape the workshop before Monarch's agents descended on her grandfather's legacy and on her. Sarah slipped out of the secret passage and into the cellar, carefully sealing the entrance behind her. The weight of her grandfather's revelations pressed down on her as she climbed the stairs. The countdown ticked on in her head. Less than 10 hours until Monarch arrived in force. The sound of a car engine drew her to the front window. A sleek black Mercedes pulled into the driveway, followed by a familiar Lexus SUV that made Sarah's blood run cold. The Matthews family vehicles. Elelena Matthews emerged from the Lexus, immaculate as ever in a tailored pantsuit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. Richard Matthews got out of the Mercedes along with a man Sarah didn't recognize. Tall, distinguished, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Wilson?" Sarah called out urgently. "We have company." But the elderly neighbor had left an hour earlier for groceries. Sarah was alone. The doorbell chimed, its cheerful sound a jarring contrast to the fear tightening in Sarah's chest. She considered ignoring it, but knowing her in-laws had seen her at the window made that impossible. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. "Sarah, darling." Elena's voice was slick with false sweetness. "We were so worried." "How did you find me?" Sarah asked, dispensing with pleasantries. Richard cleared his throat. "When you disappeared, we hired investigators. Your whereabouts are important to us, considering you're carrying our grandchild." "Your concern is touching," Sarah said dryly, "especially after you threw me out of your house." Elena at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "We were all emotional that night. Surely we can move past that misunderstanding." "What do you want?" Sarah demanded. Richard gestured to the stranger. "This is Warren Ellison, CEO of Monarch Industries, and an old family friend. He's very interested in this property." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Warren Ellison, the man her grandfather had spoken of in the recording. The one who held him prisoner for 3 years. Ellison stepped forward, extending a hand. "Mrs. Grant, it's a pleasure to finally meet Arthur's granddaughter." Sarah ignored his outstretched hand. "I've already told your representatives that the property is not for sale." "Perhaps we should discuss this inside," Richard suggested, his tone making it clear it was not a request. Reluctantly, Sarah allowed them in, keeping a strategic distance as they settled uninvited into the living room. On the coffee table lay the morning's mail, including an official-looking envelope Sarah hadn't had time to open. Elena's gaze fixed on Sarah's prominent belly. "You must be due soon. Have you been getting proper prenatal care? This situation can't be good for the baby." "My situation is perfectly adequate," Sarah replied coolly. Ellison spoke next, his voice smooth as oil. "Mrs. Grant, I understand your reluctance to part with family property, but there are complications you may not be aware of." As if on cue, Richard picked up the official envelope from the coffee table. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, he tore it open, pulling out a legal document. As I suspected, a notice of foreclosure on the property. He handed the paper to Sarah, who scanned it quickly. The document alleged that Arthur Grant had outstanding debts to Monarch Industries dating back to the 1970s, secured by the property. "This is forged," Sarah stated flatly, recognizing the fraud instantly. "The courts may see it differently," Ellison remarked. "Litigation could tie up this property for years, years during which a single mother might face financial hardship." The threat could not have been clearer. Sarah felt her baby kick, a vigorous protest against the intimidation tactics. Or, Elalina cut in, we can settle this amicably. The Matthews family will purchase the property for a generous sum. You and the baby would want for nothing. Depending on certain arrangements, Richard added, echoing his previous ultimatum. Sarah's mind raced. They were working with Monarch, perhaps had been for years. Did Michael know about his family's connection to the company that had imprisoned her grandfather? Was her marriage part of a long-term strategy to gain access to the property and Arthur's secrets? Before Sarah could respond, the front door swung open. Mrs. Wilson bustled in, followed by James Parker. The elderly lawyer took in the scene with one glance and moved protectively to Sarah's side. I think Ms. Grant has been bothered enough, Parker said coolly, setting his briefcase on a side table. And that fraudulent lien won't stand up to the slightest legal scrutiny. Ellison's expression hardened. James? Still interfering in Monarch's business after all these years? Still protecting my clients from corporate predators, Parker retorted. Richard Matthews stood up. Sarah, be reasonable. We're offering you security, comfort. You're offering a cage, Sarah cut in. Just like the one you offered my grandfather. A tense silence followed her words. Ellison's gaze sharpened, assessing her with a new intensity. So, he said softly, Arthur told you about our history together. Interesting. I wonder what else he told you before his unfortunate accident. The insinuation hung in the air like poison gas. Her grandfather's death, officially ruled as natural causes, was suddenly cast in a new, sinister light. I think you should all leave, Mrs. Wilson stated firmly. Before I call Sheriff Turner, he always had a soft spot for Arthur. After a moment of palpable tension, the unwanted visitors departed with thinly veiled threats of further action. As their vehicles disappeared down the driveway, Sarah turned to Parker. They killed him, didn't they? The lawyer's grim expression was all the answer she needed. We need to move quickly, Parker said, the moment the Matthews and Ellison were gone. That confrontation confirmed what I've long suspected. Ellison was behind Arthur's death. He made it look like a heart attack, Mrs. Wilson added, her voice hollow. Arthur was healthy as a horse. I never believed it was natural. Sarah sank into a chair, one hand protectively covering her stomach. My grandfather's message. It said I have less than 10 hours before Monarch comes back in force. Parker nodded grimly. The security alert would have gone straight to Ellison. They'll come with private security, possibly forged warrants. We need to secure the catalyst and get you to safety. I know where it is, Sarah told him, but I need to find something first. She hurried upstairs to what had been her childhood room during summer visits. The space remained largely unchanged. Faded floral wallpaper, a narrow twin bed, and a bookshelf filled with the adventure novels and science textbooks her grandfather had given her. What are we looking for? Mrs. Wilson asked, following her in. A music box, Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the room. Grandpa gave it to me for my 10th birthday. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Her grandfather, presenting her with an intricately carved wooden box, its lid inlaid with mother-of-pearl in a pattern that matched the night sky on her birth date. This is special, he had told her. Keep it safe. One day, you might need what's inside, he had told her. At 10, Sarah thought he meant the tiny ballerina spinning to the sound of Clair de Lune. Now, she understood something far more significant was hidden within. It's not here, Sarah murmured, having searched the closet and under the bed. Mrs. Wilson frowned. Did you perhaps take it with you when you left for college? Sarah shook her head. I left it on purpose. After he died, it reminded me of him too much. An idea sparked. Sarah crossed to the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines until she found it. A Wrinkle in Time, her favorite childhood novel. Opening the cover, she saw a small, ornate key taped to the inside. What's that for? Parker asked from the doorway. Grandpa's memento cabinet in his study, Sarah explained, already heading down the hall. He kept special keepsakes locked away in there, things too precious for open display. The antique mahogany cabinet stood in the corner of Arthur's study, untouched since his death. The small key turned smoothly in the lock, despite years of disuse. Inside, Sarah found carefully preserved photographs, Arthur's military service medals, her grandmother's wedding band, and other family treasures, but no music box. It has to be here somewhere, Sarah insisted, fighting a rising panic. The countdown in her mind ticked relentlessly onward. Less than 9 hours remained. Parker glanced at his watch. We should focus on securing the catalyst first. Maybe the music box isn't necessary. It is, Sarah said firmly. Grandpa's message specifically mentioned the vault key. Without it, we can't access the catalyst. Mrs. Wilson had been observing the room in silence. Now, she moved to the large oak wardrobe and opened its doors. Arthur was a man of habit, she said, reaching for the top shelf. He always kept his most precious things hidden in plain sight. From behind a stack of neatly folded sweaters, she withdrew the very music box Sarah had described. He brought it in here after you left for school, she said. He said looking at it in your empty room was too painful. Sarah accepted the box with trembling hands, its familiar weight bringing a sting to her eyes. The inlaid stars on the lid still formed her birth constellation, Aquarius. She wound the key and lifted the lid. The ballerina began her eternal dance as the haunting melody filled the room. I don't see anything unusual, Parker observed after a moment. Because you don't know where to look, Sarah replied. She pressed a specific star in the constellation pattern, Sadal Malik, the lucky star her grandfather had taught her to find in the night sky. The false bottom of the music box slid open, revealing a small compartment. Inside lay a key unlike any Sarah had ever seen. It was not metal, but a translucent crystalline material that refracted light in prismatic patterns. Beside it was a note in her grandfather's handwriting. The key does more than open locks. It completes the circuit. This is it, Sarah whispered, carefully lifting the unusual key. This will open the vault. From downstairs came the sound of shattering glass. Parker rushed to the study window and peered out cautiously. A black SUV was parked on the street. 2 men, approaching the back of the house, he reported, his voice tense. Looks like Monarch's security team. They're early, Mrs. Wilson said, her voice steady despite the danger. Or Ellison never left. Sarah realized he'd been watching, waiting for them to lead him to the catalyst. Parker pulled the elderly housekeeper and the pregnant woman away from the window. We need to get to the workshop, now. Is there any way to access it without using the cellar entrance? Sarah nodded, remembering the emergency exit her grandfather had mentioned. Through the pantry, there's a hidden door mechanism. The sound of footsteps on the back porch sent them scrambling. With the crystal key clutched tightly in her hand, Sarah led them toward the stairs, every second bringing Monarch's agents closer to the secret that had cost her grandfather his life. The hidden pantry entrance slid open with surprising silence, revealing the narrow passage to Arthur's workshop. Sarah guided Mrs. Wilson through first, then Parker, casting anxious glances over her shoulder as the sounds of the intruders grew louder. "They're sweeping the main floor," Parker whispered as Sarah sealed the entrance behind them. "How long until they find this passage?" "It's well hidden," Sarah replied, leading them down the sloping corridor. "But we have to hurry." The workshop was exactly as she had left it hours before, the countdown clock on the wall now reading 08:07:43. Sarah went straight to the vault set into the far wall, her grandfather's most secure safe. Unlike the workshop's electronic entry, this one appeared far more complex, a blend of modern tech and old-world craftsmanship. "August 28, 2010, Sarah murmured, entering the date of her last meaningful conversation with her grandfather into the keypad. A soft chime confirmed the correct entry, but the vault remained locked. Next came the retinal scan, a green light illuminating Sarah's face. "DNA confirmation required," the security system announced. Sarah pressed her palm against the indicated panel. Another chime. Another layer of security released. Final authentication. Physical key required. With trembling fingers, Sarah inserted the crystal key into a nearly invisible slot in the vault's design. As the key slid home, the translucent material began to glow with an internal blue light. The key completes the circuit, Sarah realized, remembering her grandfather's note. The crystalline material wasn't just a key, it was a conductor, a final component of the security system. With a series of mechanical clicks, the heavy vault door swung open. Inside sat a single object, a cylinder roughly 6 inches tall and 3 inches in diameter, crafted from what looked like brushed titanium, with intricate circuitry visible beneath a transparent section. A soft, pulsing blue light, the same hue as the key, emanated from its core. "The catalyst," Mrs. Wilson breathed. Sarah carefully lifted the device, surprised by its considerable weight. Beneath it lay a leather-bound folder containing detailed notes in her grandfather's precise handwriting. "The catalyst functions by restructuring energy at the quantum level," she read aloud. "It doesn't generate power, but optimizes the conversion of ambient energy into usable power with nearly 100% efficiency. The applications are limitless, from powering entire cities with minimal resource draw to revolutionizing transport and industry." Parker shook his head in amazement. "No wonder Monarch wants it. This could make fossil fuels obsolete overnight. Think of the industries it would disrupt, and the potential for weaponization," Sarah added grimly, turning the next page. "If reversed, the process could drain energy instead of optimizing it. Grandfather built in a fundamental limitation, a genetic lock that prevents the catalyst from being used in reverse mode. His DNA, and by extension, mine, contains the key sequence." Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened. "That's why they need you. Without your genetic material, they can't turn the catalyst into a weapon." "Or my son's," Sarah added, a hand moving protectively to her belly. "We share the same genetic markers." The implications hung in the room like a shroud. Monarch Industries didn't just want the catalyst. They needed Sarah, or her unborn child, to unlock its full potential. Parker checked the countdown clock. 07:46:22. "We need to make a decision fast. What are our options?" "Grandfather outlined 3, Sarah replied, turning back to his notes. 1. Release the research through secure channels, making it public knowledge before Monarch can seize it. 2. Destroy the catalyst and all research to prevent its misuse. Or 3. She paused, her voice wavering. 3, Mrs. Wilson prompted. Continue his work. Bring the catalyst forward. Develop it responsibly. A distant thud from above interrupted their deliberation. Something heavy had fallen or been knocked over. The intruders were methodically searching the farmhouse. We're out of time, Parker warned. Which option are we taking? Sarah studied the catalyst, its blue pulse seeming to match her own heartbeat. We take it with us, get somewhere safe, and then we decide. I'm not making that choice under this kind of pressure. She carefully placed the catalyst into a padded case her grandfather had prepared, adding the most critical research notes. The rest, she methodically photographed with her phone. The emergency exit, Sarah said, pointing to the far corner of the workshop. It leads to a drainage culvert a half-mile from the property. As they headed for the exit, a loud metallic crash echoed through the workshop. Sarah froze, recognizing the sound instantly. The pantry entrance being forced. They're in the passage, she whispered. Parker positioned himself between the women and the main entrance. I'll slow them down. You two go. We're staying together, Mrs. Wilson countered firmly. Arthur prepared for this contingency. She moved to a control panel and pressed a specific sequence. Steel security doors began to descend throughout the workshop, compartmentalizing the space. That won't hold them for long, Parker warned. It doesn't have to, Sarah replied, gripping the case containing the catalyst. It just needs to give us a head start. As they ran toward the emergency exit, Sarah took one last look at her grandfather's life's work, the workshop that represented decades of brilliant innovation and painful sacrifice. In minutes, it would fall into the hands of those who had hunted them relentlessly, those who had likely murdered Arthur Grant for his refusal to cooperate. The weight of legacy and responsibility pressed down on her as Sarah led the way into the narrow escape tunnel. The future of her grandfather's world-changing invention, and possibly the world's energy future, was cradled against her pregnant belly. The escape tunnel was narrow and damp, forcing them into single file. Sarah led, one hand protecting her precious cargo, the other supporting her lower back, as her pregnancy made the stooped posture increasingly difficult. Parker brought up the rear, frequently glancing back for any sign of pursuit. Much further? Mrs. Wilson asked. Her breathing labored, but her steps determined. Not far now, Sarah assured her, though in truth the tunnel felt longer than her grandfather had described. Dim emergency lighting cast ominous shadows on the rough-hewn concrete walls. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a metal ladder leading to a circular hatch. Parker climbed up first, pushing against the heavy lid. It resisted, then gave way with a groan, revealing a round opening to the sky above. Late afternoon sunlight poured in, blinding them for a moment. All clear, Parker reported. Once out, he helped Mrs. Wilson up, then reached down for Sarah, who passed him the catalyst before awkwardly climbing out herself. They emerged in a concrete drainage ditch, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. In the distance, Sarah could see the farmhouse. Black SUVs were now parked openly in the drive. Men in tactical gear moved methodically across the property. We have to keep moving, Parker urged, helping Sarah to her feet. My car is parked over at the Wilson farm. We can cut through the woods to get there. The trek through the dense forest was slow. Sarah's pregnancy and Mrs. Wilson's age forced frequent stops to rest. Each time, Parker scanned their surroundings vigilantly, while Sarah checked the security of the catalyst in its case. Did you hear that? Mrs. Wilson whispered suddenly during one of these breaks. They fell silent, listening. The distant sound of dogs barking echoed through the trees. "They've brought tracker hounds," Parker confirmed grimly. "We need to move faster or find a way to mask our scent." "The creek," Sarah suggested, pointing toward the sound of running water. "It runs along the property line, eventually connecting with Wilson Creek near your farm." Wading through the cold creek was a risk, especially for Sarah in her condition. But the alternative was worse. The water would help hide their trail from the search dogs. Mrs. Wilson led the way, her knowledge of the local terrain proving invaluable as they navigated the slippery rocks. By the time they reached the Wilson farmhouse, twilight was settling over the countryside. Parker's nondescript sedan was waiting behind the barn, hidden from the road. They climbed into the car, soaked and exhausted, but alive and with the catalyst secure. "Where to now?" Mrs. Wilson asked as Parker started the engine. "Somewhere Monarch won't expect," Sarah answered, pulling up her phone. "But first," she said, her voice tight with suspicion, "I need to examine something." During their frantic escape, a nagging question had taken root in Sarah's mind. How had Monarch known she was in the workshop so quickly? The security system would have alerted them, yes, but their response had been too immediate, too precise. "I think we were compromised before I even went in," she explained, pulling out the flash drive her grandfather had left in the secret compartment. "And I think he suspected it." Parker navigated the back roads with care as Sarah connected the drive to her phone, using an adapter from her bag. It contained a single video file and a folder of documents. The video showed her grandfather, his expression grim. "Sarah, if you're watching this, it means you've found the catalyst, and you're on the run. There's something you need to know. Monarch has had the farm under surveillance for years. Worse, they've compromised someone close to me, someone who may now be close to you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He had known about a traitor. The video continued. "I've included files detailing Monarch's illegal activities, corporate espionage, bribery, and evidence linking them to the deaths of 3 scientists who worked on the early catalyst prototypes. This is your insurance policy. If I'm captured, this information is to be made public." Sarah opened the folder and found meticulous documentation of Monarch's crimes spanning decades. Bank records, intercepted communications, photographic evidence. Her grandfather had been building a case against them, even as he perfected the catalyst. "This is enough to burn Monarch Industries to the ground," Parker observed, glancing at the screen. "How did Arthur get all this?" "He had help," Sarah realized, finding a list of code-named names, trusted scientists and ethical technologists who had aided Arthur in secret. People who believed in his vision for the catalyst's potential. As they merged onto a main highway, Sarah noticed a black sedan 2 cars behind them. It had maintained the same distance since they'd left the country roads. "We're being followed," she warned, her voice low. Parker nodded, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. He'd already seen it. "We need a diversion. Any ideas?" Sarah studied the catalyst in its case, an idea sparking to life. "Actually, yes. The next town has a bus station. I think it's time we used one of Grandfather's contingency plans." She opened the case, removing a small device attached to the catalyst's protective housing. "A tracker," she explained. "Monarch can follow this signal. So if we separate it from the catalyst, they'll follow the wrong target," Parker finished, a flicker of his younger, more adventurous self glinting in his tired eyes. As the city lights appeared ahead, Sarah carefully prepared the decoy. Her grandfather's meticulous planning was still protecting her. Even now, with the catalyst secure and the proof of Monarch's crimes in her hands, They had leverage. They had a fighting chance. The gambit worked perfectly. From the window of a diner across from the bus station, Sarah watched as Monarch agents swarmed a departing bus, their tracking gear leading them to the beacon she'd planted on a sympathetic passenger bound for Chicago. Meanwhile, she, Parker, and Mrs. Wilson slipped away in a different vehicle, a beat-up work van belonging to one of Parker's trusted clients. 2 hours later, they arrived at their destination, a modest lakeside cabin on the outskirts of Clearwater, 3 counties away from the farm. As Parker had explained during the drive, the property belonged to his sister, who only used it during the summer months. "We should be safe here for a while," he said, helping Mrs. Wilson up the porch steps. "The cabin has no traceable connection to me." The inside was rustic but comfortable, a world away from Arthur's high-tech workshop, but secure for their immediate needs. Sarah set the catalyst on the kitchen table, its subtle blue glow casting strange shadows in the dimly lit room. "I've made some calls," Parker announced, returning from a back room where he'd been speaking privately on his phone. "Help is on the way." "What kind of help?" Sarah asked, weariness settling deep in her bones. Her grandfather's warning, "Trust, but verify," echoed in her mind. Someone from Arthur's past. Someone he trusted implicitly. Mrs. Wilson, who had been quietly making tea in the kitchen, looked up sharply. "Helen Chang?" Parker nodded. "She's driving down from MIT. Should be here by morning." "Who's Helen Chang?" Sarah asked, puzzled by Mrs. Wilson's visible reaction to the name. The older woman's expression softened with something akin to nostalgia. "She was your grandfather's colleague during his university days. A brilliant physicist. They were close. More than colleagues." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "They were briefly engaged before Arthur disappeared in 1970, Mrs. Wilson explained. When he came back, something had changed. He broke it off, said it was to protect her." Sarah absorbed this new piece of her grandfather's life, a romantic past she never knew existed, and a connection still willing to help. "Helen never stopped caring for Arthur," Mrs. Wilson said softly. "Or believing in his work." Parker glanced at his watch. "We should get some rest while we can. Tomorrow, we have difficult decisions to make." Sarah slept fitfully, her baby unusually active as if sensing its mother's anxiety. At dawn, she gave up on rest and went out to the small porch, watching the mist rise from the lake as she contemplated their impossible situation. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Sarah tensed, but Parker, emerging from the cabin with surprising agility, gave a reassuring nod. "It's Helen." The woman who stepped out of the modest electric car defied Sarah's expectations. Though well into her 70s, Dr. Helen Chang moved with the energy of someone decades younger. Her silver hair was cut in a sharp bob, and her eyes, keen and intelligent behind stylish glasses, found Sarah's immediately. "So you're Arthur's granddaughter," she said by way of greeting. "I see him in your eyes." Inside, over coffee, Helen examined the catalyst with reverent hands. "Remarkable. He actually finished it." "You know what this is?" Sarah asked. "I helped develop the initial theories," Helen replied. "Before Monarch stole it. Before everything went wrong." From a worn leather briefcase, Helen pulled out a faded photograph and handed it to Sarah. It showed a group of 7 people in lab coats standing proudly before a university building. Arthur, looking impossibly young, was at the center, his arm around a beautiful Asian woman Sarah now recognized as Helen. The others, men and women of varying ages, flanked them like a protective formation. "The foundation," Helen explained. We were originally a research collective, pooling our expertise across disciplines. After Arthur fled Monarch, we became something else, guardians of his work, ensuring it would be used ethically, if never completed. Sarah studied the photograph, noting the proud determination on each face. Are they still active? 3 have passed on, Helen said solemnly. The rest of us have remained vigilant, waiting for this moment. What does the Foundation do exactly? Sarah asked. We maintain a network of ethical scientists, policymakers, and journalists ready to protect and properly implement transformative technologies like the catalyst. We have secure channels for publication, resources to protect whistleblowers, and the connections to ensure innovations benefit humanity rather than exploit it. Sarah's baby gave a vigorous kick, as if in response to Helen's words. She placed a hand on her stomach, her decision made. I want to meet the remaining members. Helen nodded in approval. They are already on their way. But first, we need to secure you and the catalyst. Monarch isn't the only entity that would weaponize Arthur's work if given the chance. The genetic lock, Sarah remembered. They need my DNA to unlock its full functionality. Exactly, Helen confirmed, which makes you their primary target. You and your child. Sarah felt the full weight of her grandfather's legacy press down on her. The catalyst was the culmination of his life's work, a potential revolution in energy technology. But it had also cost him his freedom, his relationships, and perhaps, ultimately, his life. I need to understand everything, Sarah said firmly. Before we move forward, before we release anything, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Helen's expression was a mixture of approval and sorrow. You sound just like him. By nightfall, the cabin had transformed into a command center. The remaining members of the Foundation, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a renowned energy physicist, Congresswoman Janet Rivera, who secretly championed ethical tech oversight, and Omar Khadr, an international lawyer specializing in intellectual property, had arrived, bringing equipment and determination in equal measure. Sarah absorbed their crash course on Arthur's work, and the pieces of her grandfather's legacy finally formed a complete picture. The catalyst wasn't just an energy device. It was a paradigm shift that would upend global power structures. Monarch's board realizes this would obliterate their fossil fuel interests, Omar explained, displaying financial records. They've invested billions in maintaining energy scarcity while quietly researching how to weaponize the catalyst. We've tried the legal approach for years, Congresswoman Rivera added. But Monarch has too many politicians in its pocket. The Foundation's plan was simple, but audacious. Arrange a meeting with Ellison under the pretense of a negotiation, record his incriminating statements, and simultaneously release Arthur's complete research through secure channels worldwide. Once the knowledge is public, Monarch loses its leverage, Marcus explained. But we need irrefutable proof of their crimes to stop them from claiming ownership through their original contract with Arthur. And you want me to be the bait, Sarah finished, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Helen's expression softened. It's risky, but we'll have federal agents on standby. Rivera has secured the cooperation of an uncorrupted division at the Department of Justice. After a heated debate, they settled on a strategy. Sarah would contact Ellison, claiming that fear for her child's future had driven her to negotiate. The meeting would take place in a neutral hotel conference room, outfitted with recording devices they would plant beforehand. The Foundation would monitor from an adjacent suite, with federal agents disguised as hotel staff. The next morning, Sarah made the call. Ellison answered on the first ring, his voice dripping with smug triumph. "I've been expecting your call." "I want to discuss terms," Sarah said, her voice flat. "Just us. No lawyers, no security teams. A bold request for someone in your condition." The meaning was clear. He knew she was close to her due date. "My condition is precisely why I'm calling. I want my child to have a secure future." There was a pause. "The Belmont Hotel. Noon today. Come alone." Sarah disconnected the call, meeting Helen's worried gaze. He agreed too easily. "He's overconfident," Omar noted. "Men like Ellison always underestimate women." By 11 o'clock, everything was in place. Sarah was fitted with a sophisticated recording device designed by Marcus, virtually undetectable and disguised as a maternity support band. The foundation was monitoring from the adjacent suite, while Rivera coordinated with federal agents positioned throughout the hotel. When Sarah walked into the conference room at precisely noon, Ellison was waiting, alone as promised, though she had no doubt his security was lurking nearby. He had aged since their last confrontation at the farm, the strain showing in the lines around his eyes. "You led us on quite a chase, Stu," he said, foregoing any pleasantries. "Where is it?" "It's safe," Sarah replied, taking a seat across from him. "And it will stay that way until we reach an agreement." "And what exactly are you proposing?" Sarah leaned forward slightly, activating the recording device. "Financial security for my son. In exchange, I give you access to the catalyst." Ellison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Access isn't enough. We need the genetic key to unlock its full potential." "You mean its weapons capabilities?" "I mean its full functionality," he corrected smoothly. "The energy applications alone will revolutionize Monarch's portfolio." "The way it revolutionized my grandfather's life?" Sarah's voice was hard as steel. The pretense of civility dropped. Ellison's caution gave way to raw arrogance. "Arthur was brilliant, but naive. He never understood the stakes." "And what were they?" "Global energy supremacy." Ellison leaned forward, animated by his own vision. "Imagine controlling the world's power supply. Nations, corporations, entire economies, all dependent on access we grant at our discretion." "Monopolistic extortion," Sarah observed. Ellison shrugged. "Business in its purest form. Arthur's mistake was his moral squeamishness. He feared the militarization potential, which is precisely what makes the catalyst so valuable for national security and your military contracts," Sarah added, baiting the hook. "A patriotic bonus," Ellison conceded with a chilling smirk. "Now, let's discuss terms. In exchange for the catalyst and your cooperation with the genetic key, Monarch offers $5 million in a trust for your son, plus quarterly payments for ongoing consultation." "And if I refuse?" His expression hardened. "Then things will get unpleasant. Your grandfather experienced our persuasion techniques firsthand. I would hate for history to repeat itself, especially with your child's birth so imminent." The threat hung in the air, explicit and damning. Sarah felt the baby kick hard, as if in protest. "You're threatening a pregnant woman," she stated, speaking clearly for the recording. "After admitting to imprisoning my grandfather and pursuing his invention to weaponize it against his will." Ellison's eyes narrowed, suspicion dawning far too late. "This meeting is not what you suggest." "No," Sarah agreed, just as the conference room door swung open to reveal Congresswoman Rivera and two federal agents. "It's something my grandfather should have done years ago." As the agents read Ellison his rights, a sharp pain lanced through Sarah's abdomen. Then another, more insistent. "The baby," she gasped, clutching her belly. "It's coming." The delivery room thrummed with concentrated energy. 12 hours of labor had led to this moment. Gripping the bed rails, her knuckles white, Sarah gave one last, heroic push. It was exhausting, agonizing, and yet filled with a strange euphoria. Then, the sudden cry of a new life filled the room, piercing and indignant. Sarah collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as the doctor announced, "It's a girl." They placed the wailing infant on Sarah's chest, still wet from birth and impossibly small. Time seemed to stop as Sarah gazed at her daughter's face, red and wrinkled, eyes squeezed shut in protest against the bright new world. "Hello?" she whispered, gently tracing the perfect curve of the baby's cheek with her finger. "I'm your mother." In the waiting room, Helen Chang paced nervously while Parker kept a stoic vigil by the window. Mrs. Wilson had dozed off in a corner chair, her age finally catching up with her after the turmoil of the last few days. The maternity ward door opened and a nurse appeared. "You can see them now," she announced with a smile. Sarah was sitting up in bed, her face exhausted but radiant, cradling her newborn. The baby was snug, wrapped tightly in a hospital blanket, with only her tiny face visible. "She's beautiful," Helen whispered, approaching the bed with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Do you want to hold her?" Sarah asked. The older woman's eyes filled with tears as she carefully accepted the precious bundle. "What's her name?" Parker asked, his usual professional demeanor softened by the moment. Sarah smiled, a decision crystallizing. "Artha. Artha Grant." "Arthur would be so proud," Mrs. Wilson said, her aged hand gently touching the baby's dark hair. As the others took turns holding Artha, a nurse brought in a clipboard with the birth certificate form. Sarah filled it out carefully, officially documenting her daughter's entry into the world. Signing her name at the bottom, she felt a profound sense of transition. One phase of life was ending, another was beginning. The television in the corner, which had been murmuring quietly, suddenly switched to a breaking news report. The anchor's serious expression caught everyone's attention. In a stunning development, federal agents have arrested Warren Ellison, CEO of Monarch Industries, on charges of industrial espionage, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Sources close to the investigation report that evidence provided by the granddaughter of renowned engineer Arthur Grant has unraveled decades of corporate crime, including the alleged murder of rival scientists. The report continued, detailing Ellison's arraignment and the dramatic plummet of Monarch's stock value. Several board members were also implicated, with investigations spanning multiple countries. "It worked," Parker said quietly. "The evidence packet we released simultaneously with the arrest. The Foundation's media contacts made sure it couldn't be buried." Helen nodded. "And Arthur's research is now public domain, published through academic channels worldwide. No one can monopolize the catalyst now." Sarah looked down at her sleeping daughter. "What happens now?" "Legally, you're clear," Parker assured her. "Your immunity deal with the DOJ protects you from any blowback. The farm is secure. I've hired security until things cool down." "And scientifically," Helen added, "research teams across the globe are already verifying Arthur's work. Early reports confirm the catalyst performs exactly as he claimed. Energy companies are scrambling to adapt. It's the paradigm shift he always envisioned." A knock on the door interrupted them. A nervous-looking nurse entered. Miss Grant, there are some people here to see you. They say they're your in-laws. Sarah tensed, instinctively pulling Artha closer. Richard and Eleanor Matthews. The nurse nodded. After a moment, Sarah sighed. Let them in, but you three stay, she added to her friends. Richard and Eleanor entered cautiously, both of them visibly changed from their previously imperious demeanor. Eleanor's eyes fixed immediately on the bundle in Sarah's arms. Is that? She began, her voice trailing off. Your granddaughter, Sarah confirmed. Artha Grant, not Matthews? Richard asked, his tone carefully neutral. No, Sarah said firmly. She carries my name and my grandfather's legacy. Eleanor stepped closer, hesitant. May I see her? Reluctantly, Sarah adjusted the blanket to reveal Artha's sleeping face. Eleanor brought a hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. She has Michael's nose, she whispered. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Richard finally broke it, clearing his throat. We've been following the news about Monarch. It seems we misjudged the situation, Eleanor added, surprising everyone. We owe you an apology. Our grief over Michael blinded us. We treated you abominably. Sarah watched them carefully, searching for any sign of manipulation. Finding none, she gave a slow nod. Artha deserves to know her father's family, but it will be on my terms, at my home. We understand, Richard agreed quickly. As they awkwardly discussed potential visitation arrangements, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion. Her daughter would grow up knowing both sides of her heritage. The wealth and status of the Matthews family, yes, but more importantly, the brilliant legacy of innovation and ethical conviction from Arthur Grant. Artha stirred, her tiny fingers flexing as she yawned. In that perfect, innocent gesture, Sarah saw infinite possibility, just as her grandfather had seen in the catalyst. New life, new energy, new beginnings. 6 months passed in the turn of a page. The farmhouse, once derelict and haunted by secrets, now breathed with renewed purpose. Sarah had overseen extensive renovations, upgrading the systems, repairing the weathered exterior, and transforming her grandfather's hidden workshop into a proper research laboratory. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Sarah stood on the porch, Artha nestled against her chest in a soft carrier. The baby had her father's dark hair and her mother's curious eyes, already seeming to absorb the world with an intensity unusual for a 6-month-old. Your great-grandfather would have adored you, Sarah whispered, kissing the top of the baby's head. Inside, the once silent rooms buzzed with activity. The Arthur Grant Foundation, established with funds from Sarah's settlement with Monarch Industries, had turned the estate into a hub for ethical technology development. Where secrecy once reigned, transparency now flourished. Sarah walked into what had been the formal dining room, now converted into a conference space. Helen Chang stood at the head of the table, explaining the principles of energy conversion to a group of young scientists, the Foundation's first class of fellows, selected for their brilliant minds and ethical commitment. The quantum resonance field created by the catalyst doesn't generate power, Helen was explaining. It optimizes the conversion of ambient energy with unprecedented efficiency. Sarah passed by quietly, not wanting to interrupt. In the kitchen, Mrs. Wilson, who had refused all suggestions of retirement, was preparing lunch for the research team, her energy seemingly revitalized by the home's new purpose. There you are, Mrs. Wilson smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. You have visitors waiting in the study. The Matthews, punctual as ever. Sarah nodded, steeling herself. These monthly visits were still tense, though they were gradually improving. She found Richard and Eleanor in the study, Eleanor already arranging a small collection of gifts on the side table. "There's our little angel," Eleanor cooed, approaching with her arms outstretched. Sarah carefully transferred Artha into her grandmother's arms, noting how Eleanor's normally rigid demeanor softened as she held the baby. Richard stood back, still uncertain of his place in this new dynamic. "The foundation seems to be gaining recognition," he commented. "I saw the feature in Scientific American. Helen's work is driving a lot of it," Sarah acknowledged. "The practical applications of the catalyst are developing faster than even grandfather predicted." As they made careful conversation about Artha's development, Sarah observed her in-laws. The past few months had humbled them. The exposure of their connection to Monarch's crimes had threatened the Matthews business empire. While Sarah's intervention had prevented a total collapse, their relationship remained a complicated thing, bound by Artha and a shared grief for Michael, yet tempered by past betrayals that were hard to forget. After they left, Sarah retreated to the newly completed extension at the back of the house. The large room held her office and a state-of-the-art nursery area where she could keep Artha close while she worked. On her desk lay a thick, leather-bound book, a family history she had begun to compile, complete with photographs, documents, and personal narratives. She opened to a fresh page and carefully affixed the updated family tree she had recently commissioned. The elegant document traced the Grant and Matthews lines, converging on Artha's name at the bottom. Sarah ran her finger over the names, each one representing chapters of the story that had led to this moment. The nursery monitor chimed softly, indicating Artha was waking from her nap. Sarah lifted her daughter into her arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair as they moved to the large windows overlooking the property. "This is your legacy," Sarah murmured, as Artha's curious eyes followed her finger pointing across the autumn-painted landscape. "It's not just this land, or the foundation that bears your great-grandfather's name. It's the choice he made, the choice I made, to use knowledge for the greater good, even when easier paths present themselves." A soft knock announced Parker, who entered with a folder of papers needing signatures. The foundation had expanded under his legal guidance, forming an international oversight committee for emerging technologies inspired by the Catalyst's principles. "The Patent Office finally processed the open source declaration," he reported. "The core technology is officially in the public domain, protected from weaponization by an international treaty." Sarah shifted Artha to her other hip to sign the documents. The security concerns were fading. The last of Ellison's loyal executives had been sentenced last week, with Monarch dismantled and its assets redistributed. The primary threat was neutralized. Later, as evening settled over the farm, Sarah carried Artha into what was once her grandfather's workshop. The space had been transformed. The central area now housed a demonstration model of the catalyst, surrounded by educational displays that explained its function in terms accessible to visitors. In a special glass case nearby rested Arthur's original pocket watch, restored but with its hands still frozen at 7:42. The moment time had stopped for him, now preserved as a reminder of the man whose vision had changed the world. Sarah held Artha up to see their reflection in the glass, their images superimposed over the watch. "This is where it all started," she told her daughter. "And this is where it continues. Through you." Behind her, she heard Mrs. Wilson's voice calling them for dinner. Sarah turned away from the past and toward the future, carrying her daughter into the warmth of the farmhouse kitchen, where friends now gathered like family. The legacy of Arthur Grant was alive in ways he may never have imagined, but would have surely, profoundly approved. The conditions were far from ideal, but they would have to do. Another contraction hit her, stronger than the last. Sarah drew a slow, deliberate breath, channeling the techniques from her birthing classes. Marcos clicked the stopwatch. 12 minutes since the last one. Still early, he said, his voice a low rumble. First babies usually take their time. He moved to arrange pillows behind her back. Try to rest between them. Save your strength. What about those men outside? Marcos's expression hardened for a fraction of a second. That was a secondary concern now. This cabin has been standing for 40 years. It's solid, and the entrance is defensible. His clinical assessment was strangely reassuring. Sarah nodded, then winced as the beginnings of another wave coiled in her belly. 8 minutes, Marcos noted, a hint of surprise in his tone. Moving with an unexpected quickness, he went to the stove and returned with a steaming mug. Red raspberry leaf. It helps with labor. Sarah took it gratefully. You just have this lying around? It's useful for a number of medicinal purposes. A faint smile touched his lips. Though I'll admit, obstetrical supplies weren't my first priority when I stocked this place. The next few hours blurred into a haze of escalating intensity. Before Sarah's eyes, Marcos transformed. The gruff, reclusive man was replaced by a focused, competent physician. He checked her progress periodically, his clinical detachment making the intimate examinations less awkward than they might have been. 6 centimeters, he announced. You're doing great. By evening, the contractions were coming every 3 minutes. Sarah gripped the edge of the cot, her hair damp with sweat. I don't know if I can do this. You are doing it. Marcos's voice was firm, an anchor in the storm of pain. Your body knows what to do, trust it. A sound from outside drew his attention to the window. Dusk had fallen, and with it came the sound of movement in the undergrowth, a sound too deliberate for any wild animal. They're back, Sarah whispered, her words punctuated by a sharp intake of breath. Marcos moved to the window, peering out cautiously. One man on watch. He reached for the rifle, placing it nearby but out of sight from the windows. Then he was back at Sarah's side, coaching her through the next contraction as if there had been no interruption at all. Deep breath. That's it. The contractions intensified further, the space between them shrinking to a minute. A cry tore from Sarah's throat, too powerful to contain. I need to push. Marcos examined her again. Not yet. Almost, but not yet. Breathe through the urge. The noise outside stopped abruptly. Marcos went still, listening. They heard you. I can't be quiet, Sarah gasped, as the peak of another contraction crested over her. Don't try to be. He moved to stand between the bed and the door, within arm's reach of both Sarah and the rifle. Let them hear. It might even work in our favor. How? She managed to ask between ragged breaths. Few things are more terrifying than a woman in labor, Marcos said, the faint smile returning. Even hardened men tend to keep their distance. As if in answer, the footsteps outside retreated toward the tree line. Marcos gave a grim nod of satisfaction. See? Tactical advantage. Sarah might have laughed if another all-consuming contraction hadn't seized her. This one was different. An undeniable, overwhelming urge to bear down. Marcos, she gasped. It's time. He checked one last time, then nodded, all trace of humor gone. You're right. 10 centimeters. On the next one, I want you to push. Outside, darkness was complete. The watcher had retreated, but Marcos knew they hadn't gone far. Inside, a new life was fighting its way into the world. Two forces, creation and destruction, converging on this tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere. Ready? Marcos asked, positioning himself to guide the baby's arrival. Sarah nodded, gathering her strength as the next wave began to build. Push, he commanded, his voice calm and steady. Bring your child into the world. The focused intensity of the room was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Marco snapped his head toward the back window, where a gloved hand was now reaching through a jagged hole, fumbling for the lock. Sarah, keep pushing, he ordered, his voice betraying none of the urgency of his movements as he launched himself toward the intruder. With remarkable upper body strength, Marcos propelled himself from his seat, using the momentum to grab the extended arm and twist it viciously. A choked cry of pain came from outside as Marcos slammed the arm against the window frame, forcing the fingers to release a hunting knife that clattered to the floor. Sarah screamed, half from the contraction, half from the fight unfolding at the window. I'm right here, Marcos called to her, maintaining his grip on the intruder while his free hand groped for the rifle. Keep going, you're doing perfectly. The intruder wrenched his arm free, disappearing from the broken window. Marcos quickly wedged a heavy metal toolbox into the opening, then returned to Sarah's side, the rifle now resting across his lap. That was impressive, Sarah panted. Combat training. Upper body strength makes up for a lot. He settled back into position to assist with the birth, his eyes scanning every point of entry. Focus on pushing now. Muffled voices murmured outside, several of them. The man at the window had not been alone. How many? Sarah asked, gritting her teeth as another contraction began to swell. 3, maybe 4. Marcos's voice remained level. Don't you worry about them. Hard not to, she managed, bearing down with the contraction. They're not getting in, he said, the certainty in his voice a shield. Not while I'm here. The baby's head began to crown. I can see her, Marcos announced, his professional detachment momentarily broken by a flicker of awe. One more big push, Sarah,